Please join me in welcoming Adam Nayman and presenting his book, The Coen Brothers. This book really ties the films together. Adam.
So just very, this doesn't come up. Just very, no, it's okay, it's okay. No, it's okay. Just very quickly thank Brad and also Lydia for everything they did to set tonight up. I really appreciate it. So I'm actually going to read the whole book cover to cover. It's 336 pages, and then we'll watch Fargo. Now I'm going to just talk very, very briefly before introducing Fargo. I've spent about 2 years of my life sort of neck deep in Coen Brothers stuff, neck deep in film clips and interviews. I've now presented films of theirs in New York a couple of weeks ago. I'm going to Chicago next week, so I'm very much kind of in a Coen groove. But I realize that not everybody is as obsessively into these movies as I am. So I wanted to do just kind of a brief intro, which is not directly about Fargo, but just gives some things to maybe look for by the time Fargo starts. I was almost going to do an intro that gave away some plot aspects of Fargo until some friends of mine told me they hadn't seen it. I'm just curious, because I assume everyone has seen this Oscar-winning canonical American classic. How many of you are seeing the film for the first time? Okay, keep your hand up if you would have been mad if I had spoiled the ending like I was planning on doing. I'm really glad I went with these other two clips. That's very good. So this is obviously not solely a book about Fargo. This is a book about all 16 feature films written and directed by Joel and Ethan Coen, up to but not including the upcoming Ballad of Buster Scruggs, which is going to be premiering on Netflix in November, which I'm lucky enough to have seen and is quite extraordinary. And if you want to hear about it, ask me after. It's pretty good. Fargo is a movie that I would say, among other things, is like a hinge point in the Coen brothers' career. It's right sort of in the middle. And in some ways, their career and their fame and their reputation can be divided into pre and post Fargo. Not that they were unsuccessful or unpopular before, but Fargo was the first one of their movies that really kind of touched a nerve. They'd always, to some extent, gotten good reviews, and they'd always, to some extent, been taken seriously by film critics, but Fargo really kind of pushed through that and became a kind of audience favorite. It was a box office success. It won 2 major Oscars for its original script and also for Frances McDormand's performance. And it really kind of gave them the traction they needed to make some of the weirder films they made going forward. You only get to make a movie like The Big Lebowski if you've had a hit like Fargo. But I would also say that in addition to being the hinge point of their career, there's a kind of longer spine of 3 films that it's a part of. One of the things this book argues is that the Coens films rhyme and intersect and bounce off of each other in 100 different directions. There's no, even though the chapters are each about individual films, most of them mention 10 or 12 of the Coens movies at once, because that's the kind of continuity and consistency that they have. But I think that there are 3 films that I always group together when I think of the Coens and the whole shape of their career. And they are Blood Simple, Fargo, and No Country for Old Men. So what I wanted to do by way of introduction tonight, how many of you have seen Blood Simple? How many of you have seen No Country for Old Men? Yeah, when you win the Oscar for Best Picture, you get seen. And there's no spoilers because I'm literally going to show the opening scenes of both films. The reason I want to do this is to just get at this weird question when it comes to the Coen brothers of authorship and originality. And again, I promise you I'll be brief on this. It's just that on the one hand, the Coens are acknowledged postmodernists who borrow and steal and quote from everywhere, and everyone knows this. But they're also described as wildly original. So how can these two things be true? How can they honor the authorship of all these books and movies and works of art that they subsume into their own work? And then how can they also be original and have their own signature? And when you watch the opening sequences from Blood Simple in 1984 and No Country for Old Men in 2007, you can see how both things can be true. I'm going to start in 1 second with the opening of Blood Simple. This is a momentous bit of film, even though nothing happens in it, because it's the first thing the Coen brothers ever put out into the world. Beside the trailer reel they took door to door to Jewish dentists in Minnesota to get the film financed. That's true. But when Blood Simple played at the Toronto Film Festival in 1984, this would have been the first thing anybody saw of the Coen brothers. So there's no context for them at this point. People don't know their themes or their style. People don't know that they work with different genres. People don't know that their films are violent and funny. They know nothing. They only know this opening scene. So let's take a look at the very, very first thing that the Coens put out into the world, which is the opening sequence of Blood Simple. I'll talk a little bit about it, and then we'll watch the beginning of No Country, and I'll try and prove a larger point. That is, of course, the late, brilliant character actor M. Emmett Walsh, playing the unspeakably awful and corrupt private detective Visser, who's sort of the protagonist of Blood Simple and the villain of Blood Simple and the prime mover of Blood Simple and the narrator. So the movie is filtered through his perspective. And if this was a presentation on Blood Simple, I'd have a lot more to say besides that. But it's just about it as an opening scene. So here you have these dissolves and cuts over flat Texas landscape. It's introducing you to a particular region. It's introducing you to a particular mindset, an explicitly American one. One of the wonderful consistencies in the Coens' career has been this American-Russian dialectic that plays out all the way in their most recent feature, Hail Caesar, which is about the contrast between Das Kapital and Capital Pictures, America, Russia. It plays out in Burn After Reading as well. This is the very first thing they put into the world, and already they're talking about the difference between capitalism and communism. But what they're also doing is telling us that something can always go wrong. And if there's a motto to the Coen Brothers cinema, if there's a way to describe all 16 of their films, and 17 now with Buster Scruggs, is that something can always go wrong. Joel Coen talks about loving pregnant plot situations, not just pregnancy, which they also love, e.g. Marge in Fargo and other films with pregnant characters. They love the possibility of chaos and conflict because that's the essence of drama. Something can always go wrong becomes sort of the mantra, the password that's going to hover over the rest of their films. So this is the Coens putting themselves out with an original script. Great. 23 years later, they make No Country for Old Men, for which they win the Oscar for Best Adapted Screenplay. And Joel Coen has a great line about that. They say, how did you write the script? He says, well, we took the book, and we held it open, and we copied it. And they gave us an Oscar for it. And that's because if you have read Cormac McCarthy's novel and seen the film, they're very close to each other. It's a wonderful act of reverence to a literary source. So in the case of No Country for Old Men, the question is, well, where are the Coens? Where's their authorship? When we now watch the opening scene of No Country for Old Men, there's two things that we want to look at. One is to think back on this Blood Simple clip we watched not 2 minutes ago and see the overt, I think, like amazingly like brazen self-citation that they're doing. You can take the opening scene of No Country and just layer it over the opening scene of Blood Simple, and they're the same scene, right down to the fact that it's the same Texas locations and a voiceover by a man in a white hat. They're the same. But even though they are imposing their own authorship, they are directly honoring Cormac McCarthy's text and not changing a word of it. So here you have an act of perfect adaptation and an act of perfect authorial assertion at the same time. But the other thing that we'll look for, and I'll talk more about it after the clip, is how reminiscent some of the imagery and some of the landscape is of Fargo, the movie in between Blood Simple and No Country. Now, I already mentioned them, so I won't belabor the parallels, but they're there. Only the Coens who made Blood Simple can open No Country that way, honoring their own heritage and honoring Cormac McCarthy's prose equally at the same time. And then in the middle of these two films, you have Fargo, which is not set in Texas, but is set in the Coens' home state of Minnesota, kind of hometown film for them. Blood Simple, Fargo, and No Country are the three least elusive films of the Coens' career. They do not have a lot of references in them. They are quite directly about their plots, characters, and situations. They are not annotated movies. This they have in common. Blood Simple stars Frances McDormand, who is also the star of Fargo. McDormand's character, however, in Fargo, Marge Gunderson, I think has a lot to do with Tommy Lee Jones's character in No Country for Old Men. They are moral authority figures who are rushing out to meet a kind of greed and evil and violence that, and this is the key line because you will hear it repeated in Fargo, that they do not understand. There are ways in which I think No Country for Old Men updates, revises, and makes Fargo even bleaker than it already is. But I think that Fargo is a kind of hinge point between the youthful exuberance that they showed in Blood Simple, and just the absolute late career mastery they have in No Country for Old Men makes an awful lot of sense to me. And Fargo's popularity and its classic status, the fact that it's the Coen Brothers movie with the exception of The Big Lebowski that the most people seem to love, that the most people tend to watch. How many people are seeing it like for a third, fourth, or fifth time? Exactly. Has to do with the fact that it's a little emptier, a little sparer. You don't need a film dictionary to follow it. You don't need a degree in film studies to get every joke that the Coens are making. It's simple, elemental, emotional, and direct. And that clip we just watched from No Country, keep some of these images in your mind when you're watching Fargo, because you'll see that Fargo is where they came from. That fence down the side of the road, a sort of monstrous killer in the back seat of a police car. These are images and items that get repeated, I think, between the two films in a very, very interesting way. I'm going to stop now. If you are interested in 300 pages of what I just said, the book can be bought. If you bought one and didn't have time to have it signed before the film, I can do that afterwards. I'm going to be back to talk to Brad about the film and the Coens and anything you guys want to know. Please, somebody ask me about the Mike Yanagita scene after the film in Fargo, because I love talking about it, my favorite scene in the movie. If you haven't seen the movie, you're going to think it makes no sense. It makes a ton of sense. We'll talk about it after, so enjoy.
Please welcome back Adam Nayman.
Hey, Brad.
Hey. So I was wondering, there's a character that's kind of always baffled me in this film, and I wonder if you could tell me about Mike Yanagita.
Sure. I mean, it's such an interesting scene because often in the Coens films, there are these scenes that get read as digressions. In New York the other week, we screened The Man Who Wasn't There, and the scene with Big Dave's wife, Ann Nerdlinger, who comes to his house in the middle of the night and talks about being abducted by a UFO. When Man Who Wasn't There came out, a lot of the reviews compared that to this scene in Fargo, and people sort of say, what are these digressions about? And in a movie like Fargo that seems so tight, it really does seem to sort of be like adjacent to the plot. Like it adds nothing to the plot, but when I was writing about Fargo, you always have to cite precedent and draw on what other writers have said. I mean, the Coens have never said anything about Mike Yanagita. They've never sort of said why he's there. When they were asked in interviews about him in '96, like, we don't know, weird guy, That's how they tend to talk about their films. But there's a critic named R. Barton Palmer who writes about that scene and raises some really interesting points about just like staging and costume design there that point to other things. I mean, on one hand, there's the rather outrageous sort of assimilation joke in the form of that character that he quite sticks out in a movie that is both literally and figuratively overwhelmingly white, with some exceptions, which are interesting to talk about as well. And it's like he's been assimilated into this culture to the point where his Japaneseness is sort of almost like just a visual joke, but he looks, sounds, talks, thinks, articulates like the descendant of the Viking Scandinavians that we've seen all through the rest of the movie. So there's that. But it's also the fact that Marge, who's very detail-oriented, doesn't tell Norm that she's going. And in fact, it's very carefully written and staged to show that while he knows she's going there, he's surprised by the trip. Never mentions that she's meeting Mike. She dresses up in a way that's different than she looks in the rest of the film. And he argues not that it's like a conscious choice on her part that she's trying to get away from quote unquote the norm, like her husband. She's not thinking of doing anything, but it's like an impulse that she follows. And it's a little strange and it's a little outside the everyday. And it sort of shows that even Marge in the world of this film is not fully free from temptation and impulse and corruptibility. But it's also the fact that he's a perfect double for Jerry. He's a weak, lying man who seeks a kind of validation from her the same way the husband does. I think one of the subtlest jokes in the whole movie is when they're in bed together at the end. She's just solved this triple homicide and brought this serial murderer to jail, and he's like, they announced my 3-cent stamp today. And she doesn't complain. She asks about his day. She's constantly giving men this kind of validation when she's not outsmarting them and arresting them. It's really funny. But the Mike scene, he's just so weak. And he's such a liar. What does the guy say at the dealership? A fucking liar? I mean, that's Mike. And so
there's all these models of really, really, really dreadful masculinity in the movie, and even he in this digression ties into that so tightly. And I mean, he really shakes Marge's faith in a lot of things. You know, she thinks that because he's married and the wife died, like her suspicion of Jerry, I think, is absolutely activated by the encounter that she has with Mike. The fact that she could imagine this family man is capable of that, I think, comes out of the lie that he tells her. And also, short answer, it's just a funny scene. Just like funny, incongruous, strange sequence.
And then maybe you could talk about the choice too. I mean, she's a police officer, but she's also pregnant, and
Yeah.
you've also talked about how this is a theme in other films too.
Yeah, I mean, the Coens are so interested in continuity. And, you know, it's often from the point of view of paternal anxiety, like Raising Arizona, which is such a tender movie if you've seen it, is all about the Nicolas Cage character wondering and wanting to be a dad with a wife who can't conceive. You know, the Holly Hunter character is infertile in Raising Arizona, and so their plan to kidnap kids, sort of kidnap a baby, is this kind of like harebrained but essentially good-natured scheme. And in Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, they invert that by having Holly Hunter be a woman who has like 6 babies, which is a funny joke. But I mean, Marge is like an avatar of pregnancy in the film, and people have talked about how it's a kind of life force in a movie that's filled with death. It also seems to give her a kind of moral authority. And it constantly makes us worry on some level. I mean, maybe not if we're watching the film a second time, because we know that she's competent and has a mind like a steel trap and nothing gets past her and she's the strongest person in the movie. But it makes us wonder, you know, is she vulnerable? But it's almost magical in that scene with Peter Stormare at the end. Like, this guy has killed everybody who he has come in to contact with, and he just completely falls in, you know, at her feet in front of her and is humbled by her. And the pregnancy, when she's talking to him in the car, it makes it like a kind of parental lecture. He's like the all-time sullen teenager in the back of the car. It's one way the staging kind of works. But even the moral force that she has by being pregnant, or the authority or the goodness, I find, I mean, no one asked, but I find the last part of the film just, it's like the scariest ending to any Coen Brothers movie that I know. When you look at the world that you see in this film, as good as she is at her job and as strong as she is and as decent as she is, there's only 2 more months before a kid is coming into that world. And at the time, everyone said it's such a happy ending. Like, finally, the Coens have given a movie a happy ending. I think that that's really, really up for debate.
Yeah, the wood chipper, yeah.
The wood chipper, too. I mean, it's such a hilarious image of, like, renewal and rebirth. I don't know if you noticed, that's the only scene that's a thaw in the whole film. When she's driving around the lake, we finally see some green on the trees, and it's like the blood's fertilizing the ground. I mean, it's a joke on ashes to ashes, dust to dust, and it's also just, like, disgusting and funny.
Okay, maybe we can open up to the audience now. We don't have too much time, but there's microphones on the side here, so if you just raise your hand and wait for the microphone to get to you. We have over here.
Yeah, the score is by Carter Burwell, who's their longtime composer, and in the expensive book that you can buy, he talks, actually, we talked like 3 paragraphs back and forth about the Fargo score and the circular repeating Scandinavian folk motif. The first time it plays, it's very tender and plaintive and authentic and makes you think you're watching a fable. And the second time, it's like carnival music, and it's big and inflated and bombastic. And Burwell said that that was something they talked about, that the movie exists between that kind of like folky humility and these characters who think they're way more than they are. He said that the music was kind of meant to ridicule the situation on the second pass through. But it's a really, really beautiful score. And he's done all their, every movie that they've made since Blood Simple, he's done the score. Even No Country that has no music in it, he did the score, which is the sort of natural soundscape.
I had a question about the way that the Coens, you're talking about the continuity through their films.
Yeah.
Can you talk about the continuity with their use of Steve Buscemi and how he always kind of meets this horrible fate, and how I know they've talked before about how
we have a little. Oh, sorry, go on.
I know they've talked before about how they made him talk so much in this movie that they wanted him to shut up in The Big Lebowski and that kind of stuff. And I wonder if you had any comment on that at all.
Well, I mean, yeah, this and the Lebowski performances in this and the Buscemi performances in this and Lebowski are a matched set, right? Like, he never shuts up in this, and then in Lebowski he's essentially mute. So I mean, that's a joke. But yeah, they like killing him. You know, I don't think he makes it out of a single Coen film that he's in alive. We actually have a page in the book which is sort of an artist rendering of the various deaths of Steve Buscemi. And there's a very beautiful song by a band I love called Wussy, called Donnie's Death Scene, which is a whole song about his death scene in The Big Lebowski. But, you know, his death here is pretty amazing because it doesn't stop with the death. He gets like one of the best posthumous cameos in movie history, the sock in the wood chipper. I mean, Buscemi hasn't really been in their stuff lately either. They tend to reuse the same actors, but like they use them in pockets. It's like Turturro's in all the old films, and then he's not in one for a while. Josh Brolin's been in most of the recent ones. You know, they use people like 2, 3, 4 films at a time. I'm sure Buscemi will be back. He's great. Anybody else? Yeah.
Sorry, I'll just shout.
Project.
Hi, Adam.
Hey, man.
I was just noticing in this movie, and because I'm watching the new season of the show, how much they refer to parking lots.
Yeah.
There's like there's a few parking lots in this, and then there's that whole speech in Serious Man.
Yeah.
The guy from The Big Bang Theory talking about consider the parking lot. I wonder if that's like in more of their movies.
You got me on the spot now thinking in my head about parking lots in their films, because the last fight in Lebowski takes place in the bowling alley parking lot as well. I mean, certainly the Serious Man invocation of the parking lot is the all-time best. Not to spoil the film for anyone who hasn't seen it, but God is in the parking lot. If you watch the movie to the end, he's not wrong. But but you mentioned the TV show, which I don't really watch. I mean, I've seen some episodes of it, and people ask why it wasn't in the book, and it's because they don't make it. I mean, they make money off of it as executive producers, which is fine, but it's not something that they actually make. But it's strange too that Fargo is the one of their films that's become kind of a brand. Like Lebowski's become a cult brand, and there's Lebowski Festival, but like Fargo's a TV show. And the question of why they need to call it Fargo, to me, is completely superfluous. Like, just call it something else and admit you're ripping off Fargo, because this is a distinct work of art. It doesn't need a TV show to fill it out. Sorry if people like the show. I know people say it's good. Yeah.
I'm just wondering if you had a chance to think about where this movie fits into Deakins' career. Like, it's a little bit more epic than Outside the Comics or Birthday. So if you have a chance to consider kind of the whole given how many films.
Well, so if anyone doesn't know, Roger Deakins is their cinematographer. He was nominated for, I think, like 87 Oscars in a row without winning, and finally won one for Blade Runner. He probably should have won one for No Country for Old Men above all, because the shooting in that film's amazing. But I mean, in terms of where it fits, he talks a bit in the book. Deakins super cagey about the meaning of any of the images that he's made. He comes from the Coen school of like name, rank, serial number, like that's it. Don't give anything up. But they've talked about how with Deakins they wanted this film to just have a really abstract, void-like quality. If you notice, the first half hour of the film has none of that blinding white sunlight. It's just kind of dark. It's all dark or interior. And then when Marge shows up, you get these incredible vistas, which Deakins talks a little bit about Lawrence of Arabia. And he talks a little bit, when you say that epic quality, that opening scene of the car coming over the ridge is a kind of parody of Lawrence of Arabia. It's like a snow desert instead of a sand desert. But like in terms of where it fits, it just fits where all his shooting for the Coens fits. It's amazing. And the fact that you can always tell when they're working with him instead of other cinematographers, but I wouldn't say the movies look the same. But I mean, visually, the red on white color scheme of this, like, it's one of the most, if not the most striking palette, I think, in any of their movies. Like, you wouldn't mistake a frame for this for anything else.
Hi, I'm just wondering, like, how would you compare the Coen Brothers to other filmmakers, like, in terms of, like, inspiration or, like, how their films relate to other directors who've come before them?
Well, there's this piece in 2000, which is now a long time ago, right? It feels really long in the last couple of years, especially, where Kent Jones talked about how, like, he was just worried that they were going to shut the cinema down because he just couldn't decide what to do with them. Like, are they the most derivative filmmakers of all time? Or are they the most original filmmakers of all time? Like, is the only way to talk about them to talk about all the shots and characters and character names and plot scenarios they take from other people, to the point where they're just blanks and ciphers? Or is the fact that they're so aggressively postmodern, like an identity of their own. Rewatching this, I wish I'd put it in the book. There's so much Kubrick around the edges of this movie. They use a bit of the sound design from The Shining when she's hiding in the shower, and even when he's referring to the old in-out when he's talking to the prostitute on the date. And Jones suggested even back in 2000, even before some of the really Kubricky stuff in their late films, that he's kind of their master. And that weird, grotesque comedy that they do and that really precise style kind of derives from Kubrick. But I just find it hard to talk about them in terms of influence because sometimes they're Howard Hawks and sometimes they're Preston Sturges and sometimes they're Capra and sometimes they're Kubrick. And they are these things very self-consciously. I was also talking in New York about the fact that they don't seem to have inspired the kind of imitators that like a Tarantino has. Like you'll see a movie that's like Coen-y kind of, but it's not like there were 10 years of Fargo ripoffs the way there were 10 years of Pulp Fiction ripoffs. So in terms of how you place them, it's hard. Sorry, that's not a great answer, but it's hard. Yeah.
This is maybe, I'll also but, watching this shot at the beginning when the car crests,
Yeah.
made me think about this is, I guess, 20 years after this movie, in Hateful Eight, where it's the same
Yeah.
snowscape and is there that cross-talk?
Well, I mean, possibly. Tarantino and the Coens often come up in conversation together because they're also these alpha male, muscular, broter kind of directors, and so people talk about them together a lot. Like they sometimes are like they're kind of like dorm room poster filmmakers, which is sort of unfair to both of them, but I think especially to the Coens. But yeah, there's a bit of Fargo there's a bit of Fargo in Hateful Eight for sure. But I mean, Fargo's a movie too that, other than the TV show that bears its name, I can't think of a lot of Fargo ripoffs, or I can't think of a lot of Fargo references. It's pretty singular considering how popular it is. No one's really tried to do this exact thing again. Do we have time for one or two more?
We
It's
have time
late.
for
I mean,
one
I'm
more.
tired, but I'm game. Yeah. Is that Sonia?
Hello.
Hi.
This movie made me weirdly hungry, and I was wondering if you could talk about like food in Fargo and Coen Brothers movies.
Yeah, I mean, food in Fargo for sure, because she's really hungry, right, and pregnant and stuff. The trashiness of the food, people have kind of lumped that in general under this idea that the movie is somehow cruel or breaks identification with certain of the characters, like, they're gluttonous or they're sort of tackily dressed, or, even like the Miller sign behind her when she's eating, sort of sitting by the side of the road. Like, people see a certain condescension in that. They think that but people see condescension in the Coens a lot, and I don't shrug it off. Like, it's part of the discussion around them. Jay Hoberman has always called it Coen descension, because he's a brilliant film critic. Really clever stuff. But yeah, I mean, in terms of Fargo, like she eats a lot because she's pregnant, but it's like a very honest appetite. But I mean, then it's juxtaposed with like the worms, right? And it's sort of cueing you to feel gross, or it's cueing you to feel kind of skeezed out. I mean, I take Marge's appetite in this movie as much healthier than the male appetites in the movie, which are sort of money-based and mercenary. I have a whole thing in the book about how typically in the Coens, with the exception of McDormand's character in Burn After Reading, who's one of the most repulsive characters they've ever created, Coen's female characters are not interested in money really at all in various like mercenary contexts of the movies. So the fact that Marge just kind of wants to eat as opposed to the things that we see the guys in the movie doing is sort of, maybe nice and places her on a higher moral level. In terms of food in their other movies, I haven't really thought of it. Like, there's a really phony big family dinner at the end of Raising Arizona, and Brad Pitt's always drinking from a water bottle in Burn After Reading. But this is material for future thought for me. I have no idea. Maybe, one more, and then we'll go.
Hi.
Hi.
So just wondering, you kind of touched on it just now. So female characters having these sort of non-monetary values, to tie back to sort of Blood Simple and Fargo and No Country.
And No Country, for sure.
The men, and I guess the psychopath type, strong, silent men.
Yes.
That linear kind of tie. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to spoil the end of No Country for Old Men for like the two people who haven't seen it, but they do something with the female character in No Country to move her from the afterthought that she is in the book. Without increasing her character or her dialogue or her role in the plot, they turn her as much, even in a sideways way, into the moral center of No Country, the way they do more overtly with Marge. And they even do it by rewriting some of the dialogue from Fargo at the end of No Country. It's an amazingly, amazingly strong connection. And if you watch the two scenes side by side, you're like, oh, geez, you know, like they're doing it. But even in The Lady Killers, the main character, the Marva Munson character, you know, she ends up with all this money that's been stolen on her property. And even though the place she ends up giving it is like a horrible joke, like a horrible, horrible gag, if you've seen The Lady Killers, where this African-American woman, the college she decides to donate the money to is this deeply racist institution, but she likes it because it's a Christian place. But the important part is that she doesn't keep the money. And in Blood Simple, McDormand's character is the only one who's not really thinking about money. And, you know, so I do think that that's a through line. But then they complicate it, because in Burn After Reading, the McDormand character is the analog to Jerry in Fargo. She causes so many people to get hurt, die, and get in trouble because of greed. And it's over this tiny amount of money in Burn After Reading. It's over $40,000, which is a figure that gets cited here. As well. By the way, like, bonus points for people who immediately understand Macy's scheme and what went wrong without having to go to Wikipedia or consult a financial planner. Good for you. Because one of the best things about Fargo is it's never explained. That he's lying about the serial numbers and these cars don't exist and he used it to take money. Like, it's such a stupid, stupid, stupid plan. And I don't know if anyone noticed this too. The amount of money he owes is $320,000. When the father-in-law says, why don't we argue them down to $500,000? And he says no, that would have just been it. That would have just absolutely been it. But in the same way that this dad's so greedy that he won't pay money for his daughter, Jerry's like, no, I want an extra $500,000, you know, for myself and for my trouble. So greed as a driving factor in all the Coen's movies, I mean, that's right there.
Okay, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us,
Thank
and
you, guys.
thank Adam, and remind you his book is for sale in the bookstore downstairs. So.
Thank you, guys.